On the morning of March 23, 1945, Winston Churchill sat aboard his command aircraft as it descended through heavy cloud toward western Germany. The war in Europe was entering its final weeks, but no one yet knew how the final chapter would be written or who would write it. Below the aircraft lay the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier shielding the industrial heart of Germany. For generations, the Rhine had been more than a river. It was a symbol of German security, a psychological line no enemy had crossed since Napoleon. Breaking it would mean the end was no longer theoretical. It would be inevitable. Churchill had come to witness what he believed would be one of Britain's defining moments of the war. Operation Plunder, commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was about to begin. It was not merely a river crossing. It was a statement of identity. British doctrine, British discipline, British professionalism on display before the world. Churchill had personally assured Montgomery months earlier that this operation would stand as Britain's crowning achievement in the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Everything had been prepared accordingly. 2 full months of planning, over 2 million men involved across supporting formations, 3 500 artillery pieces, smoke screens stretching for miles, airborne drops timed to the minute, engineers rehearsing river crossings again and again. War correspondents had been invited. Official photographers were already in position. Churchill himself had drafted the victory communique in advance. The message was clear: this is how a professional army ends a war. Then the radio crackled. The message that reached Churchill's aircraft was short, almost deceptively casual. American forces under General George S. Patton had crossed the Rhine. Not this morning. Not under Operation Plunder. Not with Montgomery's permission. They had crossed the night before. For several seconds, no one spoke. Churchill did not move. His military secretary watched him carefully. This was not simply bad news, it was destabilizing news. It threatened the entire political architecture of the Allied command. Patton had crossed at Oppenheim using assault boats. There had been no massive artillery barrage, no airborne drops, no weeks of visible preparation. Third Army had gone straight across, established a bridgehead, and was already expanding it. Churchill understood the implications instantly. Operation Plunder had not yet begun, and it had already been eclipsed. To understand why this mattered so deeply, one must understand what Montgomery had been promised. On January 12, 1945, Churchill had personally assured him that plunder would be the centerpiece of Allied victory in Europe. The British Army, often criticized for being slow and overly cautious, would prove its professionalism beyond doubt. Montgomery took that promise seriously. He believed, as he always had, that wars were won through preparation, discipline, and overwhelming force. Speed without control was recklessness. Improvisation was dangerous. Coalition warfare required structure or it collapsed into chaos. Patton represented the opposite philosophy. The night before Churchill's flight, at 10:37 p.m. on March 22nd, Patton had called Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower from Luxembourg. According to the CEF telephone log, Patton delivered his update with characteristic bluntness. Third Army had crossed the Rhine. Casualties were light. The bridgehead was secure. Eisenhower's immediate reaction was not congratulatory. His first question was simple and loaded: had Montgomery approved this? Patton's reply was pure Patton. Montgomery had his own crossing planned for the next day. Patton said he didn't want to bother him with details. Eisenhower knew exactly what this meant. Patton had not merely seized an opportunity. He had ignored the agreed strategic framework of the coalition, and yet he had succeeded. That combination was explosive. Within minutes, Eisenhower contacted Churchill. The war might be almost won, but the alliance was suddenly at risk of tearing itself apart. At 6:18 a.m., Montgomery received confirmation that American forces had crossed the Rhine 12 hours earlier than scheduled. Multiple staff officers later described his reaction. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst. He became still. To Montgomery, Patton's action was not initiative. It was strategic insubordination. Coalition warfare, Montgomery believed, depended on obedience to shared plans. If generals began acting independently at the strategic level, unity collapsed. It did not matter that Patton had succeeded. Discipline, in Montgomery's view, mattered more than results achieved outside the chain of command. He demanded Patton be relieved of command immediately. The message Montgomery sent to Churchill was formal, clipped, and uncompromising. An American general had violated agreed Allied planning. British forces, he wrote, could not operate alongside commanders who ignored authority. Patton must be removed at once. Churchill received the message at 9:15 m.m., just minutes before his aircraft landed. His secretary later recalled that Churchill read it 3 times without speaking. Then Churchill asked for facts. The facts were devastating. Patton had crossed first. Casualties were minimal. The bridgehead was expanding. Hitler's last great defensive line in the West had been breached before Montgomery's operation even began. Churchill stared out the aircraft window at Germany below. Montgomery was not just a commander. He was Churchill's chosen general, the embodiment of British military values. Churchill had defended him repeatedly against American criticism, but Patton had just done in one night what Montgomery required 2 months to prepare. And Churchill knew what this meant beyond the battlefield. Support Montgomery, and Churchill would be demanding the firing of an American general for succeeding too quickly. Support Patton, and Churchill would publicly admit that British military prestige had been overtaken. There was no clean choice. When Churchill landed at 10:52 am, Montgomery stood waiting on the tarmac, rigid, formal, controlled. "Prime Minister," Montgomery said, "thank you for coming to witness Operation Plunder." Churchill replied evenly, "Field Marshal, I received your message. Walk with me." They moved away from the assembled officers. Montgomery spoke first. Patton's insubordination could not be tolerated. Command authority had to be enforced now, or it would mean nothing later. Churchill raised his hand. He asked Montgomery a single question. If Patton had asked permission to cross the Rhine at Oppenheim last night, what would you have said? Montgomery did not hesitate. He would have denied the request. The crossing distracted from the main effort. Churchill pressed him gently. "Your main effort, or the Allied main effort?" Montgomery insisted they were the same. Churchill paused, then asked quietly, "Bernard, is this about strategy or pride?" Montgomery bristled. He said it was about discipline. Churchill's response landed like a blow. "It's about Patton making you look slow." The words hung in the cold German air. Montgomery tried to respond, but Churchill continued. He reminded Montgomery that he had defended British methods throughout the war. Careful preparation had saved lives. Overwhelming force reduced casualties. These principles had mattered. But the war was ending. Germany was collapsing. Every day spent preparing was a day the Soviets advanced further west, and Patton understood that. Churchill did not answer Montgomery immediately. He did not need to. The question he had asked, whether this was about strategy or pride, had already exposed the fault line beneath the argument. Montgomery believed in discipline as a moral absolute. Churchill believed in discipline as a means to an end. And that end, in March 1945, was no longer symbolic victory or prestige. It was speed. The war was no longer about defeating Germany. Germany was already defeated in everything but formal surrender. The war was now about who would arrive first, who would occupy which cities, and who would shape the post-war order of Europe. Churchill understood that reality better than most. The Soviet armies were advancing relentlessly from the east. Their momentum was terrifying in its scale. Every day they pushed deeper into Germany, increased Soviet leverage at the negotiating table that would inevitably follow the war. Borders, governments, and futures were being decided not by speeches but by where armies stood when the guns fell silent. British caution, once a virtue, was becoming a liability. Montgomery, however, saw something else entirely. To him, coalition warfare survived only if rules were enforced regardless of outcome. If Patton could cross the Rhine without permission today, what would stop another commander from doing something similar tomorrow? The alliance, in Montgomery's view, was built on structure, not improvisation. Churchill did not dismiss this concern. In fact, he agreed with it in principle. But principle was no longer enough. Churchill asked Montgomery to consider the political consequences of his demand. If Patton were relieved, it would not merely discipline an American general. It would publicly humiliate the United States at the moment of victory. The Americans were providing the majority of Allied manpower. They were bearing the bulk of casualties. They were funding the logistics that made the entire campaign possible. And their general had just achieved what the Allies had been trying to do for years. Churchill explained that demanding Patton's removal would force him to admit something Britain could not afford to say aloud: that British pride mattered more than ending the war quickly. Such an admission would not strengthen Allied unity, it would shatter it. Montgomery argued that allowing Patton to escape consequences would undermine command authority permanently. Churchill countered with a harsher truth. Authority that could not enforce results was already weakened. The silence between them grew heavy. In the distance, the sound of artillery began to roll across the landscape. Operation Plunder had begun. Montgomery's crossing, meticulously planned and flawlessly executed, was unfolding exactly as intended. Thousands of guns fired in coordinated barrages. Airborne troops descended. Smoke screens concealed the riverbanks. It was a masterpiece. But it was no longer decisive. Everyone present understood that the psychological moment had already passed. Patton's crossing had changed the narrative. The Rhine was no longer an obstacle to be overcome. It had already been breached. Churchill placed a hand on Montgomery's shoulder and spoke with quiet finality. He told him that history would remember his victories, but history would also remember that an American general crossed the Rhine first. Not because he was more professional, but because he was willing to risk everything on speed while others calculated perfection. Montgomery said nothing. Churchill turned and walked back toward his aircraft without watching the crossing. According to his military secretary, once aboard, Churchill sat in complete silence for nearly 20 minutes. No dictation, no conversation, only the distant rumble of guns carried through the air. Then he asked for pen and paper. The message he dictated to Eisenhower was carefully worded. Montgomery's request had been received. After consideration, Churchill would not support any action against Patton. While the operation had not been coordinated, it had been successful and contributed directly to Allied objectives. No disciplinary action was recommended. Before signing the message, Churchill paused. Then he added a handwritten postscript: "Keep Patton moving." Those 4 words captured the decision Churchill had made, not just about Patton, but about the future of the war. Speed mattered now more than ceremony. Momentum mattered more than precedent. That evening, Churchill met privately with his personal physician, Lord Moran. Moran's diary provides one of the most revealing records of Churchill's private thoughts during the war. What Churchill said that night was not intended for history. It was an admission. Churchill appeared exhausted. He poured himself a whiskey and spoke candidly. He told Moran that he had chosen American results over British pride. Montgomery would never forgive him. The British military establishment would be furious. Years of doctrine, years of identity, had been undermined in a single night. But watching Patton cross the Rhine, while Britain prepared an elaborate demonstration, had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding for years. Britain was no longer the senior military power in the alliance. It had not been for some time. Moran asked whether Churchill regretted the decision. Churchill answered immediately, "Not for a second." Pride did not win wars, speed did. Patton understood that. Montgomery did not. But Churchill went further. He told Moran that this moment revealed the true nature of coalition warfare. Montgomery was correct in theory. Patton had violated protocol. In a properly ordered military, he would face consequences. But the Allies were not operating a traditional military hierarchy. They were managing a coalition of competing national interests, and the side with the greatest resources inevitably set the rules. That side was no longer Britain. it was America. Churchill admitted that he had spent much of the war pretending Britain and the United States were equal partners. On paper they were. In reality, the balance had shifted irrevocably. The Americans supplied the men, the material, and increasingly, the operational leadership. Patton crossed first not because he was reckless, Churchill said, but because American military doctrine had evolved beyond British caution, not in bravery, not in training, but in willingness to move faster than comfort allowed. That, Churchill said, was the future of warfare, and Britain was no longer leading it. The consequences of Churchill's decision rippled quickly through Allied command. Montgomery never forgave him. Their relationship, once warm and collaborative, became cold and strictly professional. British senior officers felt betrayed. The chiefs of staff submitted a formal protest, warning that failure to discipline Patton undermined the entire command structure. Churchill's response was blunt. Would they prefer he demand Patton's removal and watch the Americans ignore him? That, Churchill argued, would damage British authority far more than accepting an uncomfortable truth. The decision also sent a clear signal to American commanders. Operational success would be rewarded, even when it violated established protocols. Initiative, speed, and results mattered more than formal permission. Patton understood this immediately. After learning that Churchill had declined Montgomery's demand, Patton wrote in his diary that the British finally understood the reality of the war. America would finish it their way. This was not arrogance. It was recognition of momentum. In the weeks that followed, American forces surged deeper into Germany. The collapse accelerated. German defenses crumbled before they could be organized. Cities fell with minimal resistance. The race toward Berlin intensified, even as political agreements limited how far Western forces would advance. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim proved to be a psychological breaking point, not just for Germany, but for the Allied alliance itself. It marked the moment when British military leadership ceased to define the tempo of the war. Churchill acknowledged this openly in his post-war memoirs. In Volume 6 of his History of the Second World War, he devoted an entire chapter to the Rhine crossings. He described Montgomery's Operation Plunder as a masterpiece of careful planning and execution. But he contrasted it directly with Patton's crossing, which achieved the same strategic result in one night with a fraction of the resources. The contrast, Churchill wrote, was instructive and uncomfortable. In a private letter to Eisenhower in 1953, Churchill was even more candid. Eisenhower had asked whether Churchill ever regretted not supporting Montgomery's demand to fire Patton. Churchill's answer was unequivocal. No. Patton had won the race to the Rhine. He had helped end the war faster. He had saved lives by denying the Germans time to organize coherent defense. Was he insubordinate? Absolutely. Was he necessary? More than Churchill had wanted to admit at the time. The hardest lesson of coalition warfare, Churchill concluded, was that victory often required choosing between pride and results. Montgomery wanted Patton punished for breaking the rules. Churchill understood that Patton had exposed a deeper truth. In modern warfare, the side that moves fastest wins. And Britain, once the empire that defined military excellence, could no longer move fastest. It could only try to keep pace.